I'm Deborah Feldman, the author of The Convention of Wives. Today I'll be joined by Patti Steckler to discuss the characters in the novel to illustrate the challenges often faced in marriage. If you have not completed your read, I would politely suggest you wait to watch this segment until you finish your reading experience, because we will get into the details of the plot in our conversation. Patti received her Ph.D. in clinical psychology from Case Western Reserve University and a master's degree from Johns Hopkins University in science and medical writing for the general public. She recently retired from clinical practice to devote herself full-time to writing creative nonfiction. Welcome, Patti.
Thanks, Deb. I'm so happy to be here to talk with you about marriages and couples and the challenges that couples face in marriages. Just as kind of an overview thought, I think what couples are looking for when they join together and make that lifelong commitment is fundamentally to feel cherished and loved and seen, noticed, and valued by their partners. There's so many ways in which life can interfere with that. And some of the key ones, but there are many more one can Google if you want, I'll just cover a few: lack of attention, lack of appreciation, trust issues, selfish behavior. Those kinds of things, when those needs are not met, can lead to anger and also jealousy and sometimes, sadly, infidelity. So we'll try to unpack some of these complicated issues as they affect these four characters. But before we begin to talk specifically about Dina and Rob and Julia and John, I also want to suggest keeping in mind and highlighting two key factors that also can impact all marriages, and those are secrets and family history.
Absolutely.
So let's address a few of these topics, Deb, by talking about our couples and what they went through in their marriages, and what are some of the pivotal moments of marital tension that you wrote about?
So I think we might want to start with, to me, almost the most impactful moment that spins the rest of the book around it. And that's the fateful night in Barbados when Julia and Rob's daughter, Rosie, was conceived. All four of these people, the two couples, played a role in what happened. Dina was angry at Rob for wanting his mother to live with them. And that's one of the issues with marriage, especially long-term marriage, anger, and she was feeling lack of appreciation. Rob was very frustrated. He couldn't satisfy Dina. He couldn't satisfy his mother. And he was exhausted by life, by his career, by his relationships, by trying to make everyone happy. And I think in that moment, he felt unsupported by Dina and was going through a lot of stress just personally himself. Julia was not receiving attention that she needed from John. And, that goes somewhat back into her history. Perhaps you'll touch upon that, but who she was as a person. And she craved attention from males and from Rob in that moment, and acted out that evening. And then John was jealous and seemed to have edge from the moment the couples arrived at the hotel. There was something about him that seemed angry. He was jealous of Julia's flirtation with Rob, and just didn't seem happy to be there in general. So, he brought all of his background and whatever he was feeling in that long weekend with him. So perhaps you can discuss some of their actions and their reactions that night that led to Rob and Julia on the beach.
Sure. I think that is a great kind of key scene, pivotal scene to talk about. I love that you chose that one for launching this discussion, because there is so much to unbundle in this significant evening that has to do with all of the main themes of the book. So so I think it did all come to roost in kind of an explosive and very high, like, tension wire series of events that snapped in the acting out on Rob and Julia's part. So the mother-in-law, let me go into Dina and Rob. Rob's mother is a very powerful figure throughout the story. Whether she's present or she's not there, she's kind of always there.
Yeah.
She's in the background. She's pulling at Rob. She is a very difficult mother-in-law for Dina to manage, and Dina tries, I would say, in a nuanced way to please both her husband and be a good daughter-in-law. But there are huge tugs on Rob in both directions. And in that night in particular, Elsa, the mother-in-law, is especially needy, really demanding a lot of Rob. And it pushes Dina to kind of a fever pitch, very understandable, but she really wants to know that her husband is her husband primarily and not her mother-in-law's son first. So
Patti, if I may interrupt. So can you talk a little bit about Elsa and her Holocaust background and the relationship that might occur between a Holocaust child and parent, and how that might have impacted what happened?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So there's whole literature that's written about not just Holocaust survivors, but actually on the next generation, the offspring of Holocaust survivors, and Rob is prototypically one of those. It seems as if, especially the good-hearted next generation, and Rob is just that, carry an extra special burden, more than other offspring may be. Maybe not more than offspring of other parents who've had traumatic experiences in their life, but certainly what's been well studied is what happens to the likes of Rob and his generation growing up with a parent who survived the Holocaust after suffering profound loss. And that next generation, so Rob, carries a lot of the burden, feels a very high level of responsibility for his mother, her well-being and her happiness, and kind of like vibrates, quietly, but always ready to kind of be pounced upon to help her.
Yeah.
So it's like the tension from the moment he was a child, one can infer, was already fairly high wire in terms of the connection to his mother. And that comes to, sorry.
Yes, go ahead.
As I say, that gets brought into the marriage. And that falls to, comes to roost on the wife, on Dina in this case.
And do you think the fact that Dina's background was so different, she was much more of she had much more of an Americanized Jewish experience. I wonder, how much empathy she had to pull upon, during these kinds of moments with this couple, and how much she could or couldn't identify with what Rob was going through.
Yeah, that's a wonderful question, Deb, and it is addressed. I mean, it's sort of captured in this story that, Dina has a tremendous amount of heart for people who struggle and for people whose lives are different from hers. But as another Jewish partner in this marriage, she has a very different background. And, her family came to the United States at a much earlier point. They were assimilated at a much earlier point. And then Dina ended up growing up under much more comfortable circumstances. So they were quite cushioned from the blows that, that directly hit Rob and his mother. And, I mean, insofar as empathy in part comes from life experience, there probably was an impasse of sorts, that not precluded, but made it difficult for Dina to really understand why, Rob was so attached and connected to his mother.
Yeah. So that's interesting about that couple. And what about John and Julia? Maybe we can get into their dynamic a little bit then.
Sure. So they are, there certainly are lots of similarities between Julia and Dina in terms of what their life experience is like as mothers, as wives of doctors, as mothers with multiple children. All the demands, that kind of morning, noon, and night that were on them, and John, for different reasons than Rob, is pulled away. Rob's pulled away because in reality, he's got that mother who really is very needy and who had suffered a great deal. John is a little more mysterious and harder to fathom because he's shut down, in my opinion. He's a kind of brittle character. We learn that he lost his brother, who was very precious to him, Laurie.
Right.
He learned about serious illness on the part of his father. That there were significant losses to him that were of a dramatic nature. But the impression one gets is that rather than kind of grow and become more empathic and receptive to other people in his life, especially to Julia, he became brittle, critical, shut down, and hardened. Yes. And I think, for Julia, especially with so many children, and also Julia having grown up where boys had a more significant role than girls. Boys went to college. College was not an option in Julia's family, even if she might have wanted to pursue a career. She's kind of, there was a thumb on her growing up, and then a big thumb on her in her marriage to John. So talk about not feeling cherished. That would be Julia.
And I actually want to bring up that that is something that Dina and Julia share in their development. Dina was also pushed aside by her brothers.
Yes.
Even though initially she had a lot of her father's attention as a young child, but as soon as her brothers were in their more formative years, her father's attention completely shifted.
Absolutely.
And Dina and Julia also grew up more in the 60s. Than perhaps my generation and yours, their choices were different. I mean, ours are changing. Our next generation, our daughters' choices are changing, but they, were 10 to 15 years before. Children of who were born right after, much more close to World War II, and had a very different experience as far as education and career and expectations. So the two women share that frustration. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And one of the things I like about the book and the story is that there's heart on the part of the author for how these girls were raised, because it would be easy to just be judgmental. One could just say in a black and white way, not fair. The girls were, there were lower expectations or different expectations for girls, very low expectations for girls as far as careers were concerned, and very traditional of that time expectations for the sons that they could climb as high as they wanted to career-wise, but also weren't necessarily expected to be partaking and participating in the child rearing and family life.
Right.
So what I like is, though it would be easy to say, oh, not fair that, Dina's and Julia's parents didn't treat them equally. the nuances in in the development of the story give both sides. You do capture that this was the time, and that the parents of that generation were doing what was pretty much expected, which was, raising their daughters to be good wives and mothers.
And how do you think this played into what we saw that night on the beach? How do you think their lack of agency, perhaps, within their lives, the limitation of the roles that society was imposing on them, frustrated them, and within their own marriages, within their lives, contributed in some way to each couple's dynamic?
Yeah, that's I agree. Meaning I agree that night was really a very pivotal night, and totally believe that the tensions that we're talking about for the wives, the stressors on the husbands in very high demanding careers with long hours and and life related traumas in the nature of their work, probably on a regular basis, had all of that going on. And the women were frustrated to an extreme. They couldn't be validated in the ways they wanted to by their husbands. They couldn't be validated by the ways they would like to have by an outside career, or maybe in a very minimal way. You certainly couldn't be validated by little children that they were raising. They could be loved and cherished and hugged, but not validated by them. Yeah. So I think that night was a bunch of raw emotions. Right. Dina feeling like, well, I don't know where I am. I come second, third, or fourth to my mother-in-law. Or just don't count. Mm-hmm. And for Julia, I mean, when they arrived at the resort that day, John was particularly critical and really mean to her. Yeah. And for whatever reason, but he, jealous, nasty, kind of punitive with her. And so I think that both of the women felt like, there was nothing there for them, from the very people who they loved the most or wanted to have loved them the most. So I think with all of that, and add in, a little bit of alcohol and
right, always dangerous.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, things happen, and it's understandable. Maybe not, not wise, but it's very understandable.
Yeah. I want to just get to something you touched upon. You talked about loss a little bit, and let's talk about that a little bit, and then get back to life stages, because these were two couples who were relatively early in their marriage. Yeah. So let's talk about the loss that each of them had suffered and how it might have impacted, and then let's talk about transition within marriage over the years. We saw these two couples again, relatively early on. So loss first, and then stage.
Okay. All right. So I mean, I think loss is at the foundation of each individual in these two couples. More loss than in other couples. There was a significant amount of sort of dramatic loss that added, again, an undercurrent of boiling water or steamy water that could so easily kind of rupture and and blow up at the surface. And it's not just like by loss, Deb. It's not just the loss of the experiences that the four of them were having in their current lives. I mean, it is profoundly true in the case of the four of them, that they were all haunted by past losses. And just as we were talking about the survivor offspring of Holocaust victims,
right?
In other cultures too, with other family histories, the past losses or past traumatic events can certainly embed themselves, in the family undercurrents. Again, not necessarily spoken of, not necessarily articulated, but very much have an impact. So for John, for example, he shuts down. I mean, I'm guessing, and that's how I would interpret that he shut down because of the loss of his brother and just not a way of dealing with it. Rob has to deal with the loss of his own father and some mysteries that becloud that. He has to deal with his mother's remarriage. Julia has, she loses her main support as John becomes more removed from her. And also in her family growing up, I mean, there was an origin dating back to Scotland and Barbados.
Correct.
That's part of the family lore, where her father, her I don't know, grandfather, great grandfather was sent to Barbados. He was an indentured servant. He then made his way up and had farmland and owned property, but was separated from his wife and son for 9 years.
Right.
They reunited, and then in successive generations, everything got lost. Yeah. So these are major. These are not, this is not like little losses. These are ones that we consider to be big losses and significant ones.
Yeah.
And for Dina, though there wasn't that kind of traumatic loss within her family, she inherited it when she married Rob. So she, you also get
you marry the family, as they say.
Exactly. And then the role stuff, for her too, that you're going to be, you're looking for your MRS degree and not, to be valued for wonderful designs that you were trying to, to share with your dad.
Right.
So I think there was very significant loss in all of them. And, at one point I found myself thinking about these four characters as, as people all individually surrounded by the walls of their ancestors, because for Dina too, her family going back a few generations.
Correct, with Miriam and
there were anti-Jewish pogroms in Russia, and much of her family suffered the kinds of losses that Rob's mother suffered 100 years or so later. So it's all embedded there, and so I kept thinking, or at least I started to think about each of them as being surrounded, Dina, Rob, Julia, and John, with the walls of their ancestors' ever-changing lives papered over with a veneer of normalcy. But inside was stuck loss and instability, and just a lot of hidden sorrow and loss. And I think that in some ways they were all the displaced persons that Rob was told by his mom was his father's story, even though that ended up not really being true, not entirely true.
Yeah.
So,
well, and how many, most people come to a marriage with some kind of dysfunction trailing after them. And these were historically some significant traumas. And for both couples, their baggage, you could measure, I guess, compare them and say, Dina perhaps was less immediately traumatized, Rob more so, and et cetera. But over time, couples either figure out how to bring that baggage to the marriage and deal with it with each other within the construct of the couple, or not. Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about later in life, or later in marriage, what might happen and why some couples seem to be able to do well regardless of what they have experienced as children or their parents have experienced, and other couples don't.
Yeah, no, that's another great question. because I think what makes it or not for couples is probably not so much what they bring with them, all the things that we've been talking about, even though in this case it's quite a bit. It's what they do with it. And from what we understand of successful versus unsuccessful marriages, the successful ones are all successful because of good, developed ways of coping and communicating within the marriage. It's not the nature or the difficulty of what needs to be unpacked, like the baggage that we bring. It becomes much more about how much the couple can mature, how well they can hear each other's voices, how committed they are to maintaining emotional and sexual intimacy, how they see themselves as people who are really wanting to transcend difficulties, even the ones that are very, very thorny and dispiriting. And so they keep climbing upward, even if that climb is along thorny pathways, and rutted roads with sharp rocks that they have to climb around. Unsuccessful couples, the ones that don't make it or make it but then sort of stay miserable, they don't develop those skills. They don't necessarily appreciate that they can transcend, that it's not a matter of a different choice. It's a matter of like staying within and building something that ultimately is really, I think, one of the most beautiful monuments one can construct in one's life. It's the transcending over all of the above, because every marriage has this, and finding your way together and loving each other, not despite the difficulties, but actually because of them, because of what you've learned from them in life, and because of how dear and precious you are to one another. And that's what I think.
I love your perspective on this. I think you verbalized it so well.
Thank you.
Much better than I could have. Absolutely. That's wonderful. And so you in practice, you see couples, I'm sure you see couples who come to you with communication issues, and some of them successfully move on and some don't. And how much of this can be learned? I mean, I know there are lots of tools out there on, as you mentioned before, you can Google the problems, you can probably Google some of the solutions.
Right.
But how much of this is capacity to learn, and how much of it is wanting and a willingness to learn, and perhaps a dedication to that relationship?
Yeah, that's so the willingness is probably the most important factor. Capacity, unless there are other mitigating factors, unless there is some psychiatric diagnosis that precludes functioning really well, or there are other factors, if there's addiction, alcohol or drug addiction, those can eradicate willingness, at least undermine it. But there's a lot of reason to be optimistic about marriage as an institution, because if both people, and it needs to be both, are committed and willing and wanting to make the marriage work, they can make it work. You don't need a special kind of skills. You don't need a particular kind of personality. You don't need a formula. You just need to want to try and to keep on trying.
That's good to hear. I think for a lot of people listening, that might be very good to hear. You mentioned sexual desire, and I don't want us to not note that we're not running out of time, but we might want to have to continue this on another call. Let's touch upon, pun intended, sexual desire in a marriage, and then we may have to come back for a second visit for some of our other topics. But let's perhaps end with sex, I think.
Okay, good one.
Okay.
It's interesting in this couple, I mean, these two couples, because there's a bifurcation, because Julia has lost her sexual desire for John maybe because of all the parenting responsibilities, probably, in my opinion, more so because he just doesn't treat her with respect and show that he values her. And I think perhaps whatever initially brought them together, and they got together very young.
Right, they had not the best beginning of getting together.
No,
Absolutely.
right. It wasn't an adult choice. It was a pregnancy-driven decision.
Correct.
And I think I think they didn't know what they were getting into, either one of them. And there was there was just no evident capacity to transcend on John's part. I think Julia had the capability of it. And so sex fell apart. It kind of seemed like it pretty much disappeared other than the birth of their children.
Yeah.
With Dina and Rob, there's, that's a hotter relationship, and even when things aren't good, you can tell that, that each of them has drive and is attracted to the other. I would say Dina, of the four characters, has the most robust sexual drive in a really good way.
Hold on 1 second there.
Sure.
1 sec. Give me 1 sec. We're gonna edit this out. Okay, go ahead. I did want to mention though that the genesis of Rob and Dina, was a flirtation, was just a very natural attraction to each other, and also that they, although Julia also had quasi-medical, healthcare background and could speak that language to some degree with John, but Dina, being a nurse and meeting Rob in the hospital, was. And in the way that they did, was very different than John and Julia's start. So,
yeah, I think that's
meaningful, very meaningful, I think.
Yeah. And they found their way back to each other after the big rift, and it was very sexually charged, and that is a healthy, really important. It's a whole source of vitality in marriages, that if sustained, can really give the couple a lot of joy and create the flow of emotional intimacy that can both drive the sexual desire but also stem from it. So you feel, even with Dina and Rob, when things aren't going well, that can be the sexual part of their life can be reaccessed, and it will be. Feel sort of confident that it will be restored when they're in a less fraught state.
Interesting. As opposed to John and Julia,
yes,
who didn't really have that to draw upon.
No, exactly.
Initially. Yeah.
Yeah, that's it's a big contrast between the two couples.
Very interesting. Let's, because I think we have a few more moments.
Okay.
Let's talk about the dynamic of forgiveness. There are a lot of secrets in this book, and they come out in different ways at different times. And it's not just between the couples, but it's between parent and child. And what about the ability to forgive and to move on in relationships? How does that affect couples in particular?
Yeah, it's very important. And when I talked a few minutes ago about transcendency, the couple, when you have that couple that has their willingness drives them to sustain their marriage and to grow it, even if they're at a major impasse. The people who are like that will build forgiveness. Even if an immature person like these, the four young people, when we know them, early on,
Right.
don't have the maturity to be even thinking about things like this. They're not going to forgive each other. They probably don't have a lot of empathy for one another.
Yeah.
But couples that grow also with a capacity for forgiveness. And Dina really gets challenged with this, when she goes to talk to each of her parents
Right.
about what she's learned about Rosie, and where the expectation was that each of her parents would be embracing and totally sympathetic of her and take her side 100%. Her father's like, well, what did you do?
Right.
And her mother was like, I have a grandchild, and like, get over it.
But of all people to go to, her father, who had cheated on her mother his entire
Exactly.
marriage, and
Exactly.
a mother who knew.
Yeah, I know,
And
and forgave. So but what they did, whatever their stories were, was, to really push Dina in a way that, it was sort of a nice, I like that kind of twisty surprise in the story, because you expect them each to say that blah, 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 SOB, husband of yours, come back to us, get rid of him. And,
right.
and they're more balanced about it. And they're basically teaching her lessons of forgiveness, whether she wants those lessons or not.
Yeah.
So, and for whatever reasons, it doesn't mean they're saying to her, you should live your life my way, but they are saying to her from an older generation's perspective, like, you think about this, just think about it,
Yeah.
And in hindsight, she does, right? She does think about, like, how was she that night in Barbados, when Rob, mentioned the possibility of having his mother come and live with them. How sympathetic or empathetic was she to him? And she's willing to think about that. And also between the two women, because when Julia and Dina get together around what's going on in Rosie's life and her illness, not only is Dina justifiably, really angry at Julia, like, totally warranted, but Julia then kind of comes back with, well, yeah, it was superficial, the relationship, she claims. So there's lots of those challenges. So the more mature characters, and and I would say that's all but John.
Mm-hmm.
They keep on building a commitment, a capacity for, and a commitment to forgiveness, which is really lovely.
So they're tilting in.
They're tilting in,
as opposed to tilting out.
Exactly.
Yes.
Exactly.
And I guess that's a life choice, and people make it along the way for all different reasons.
That's right.
But especially in a long-term marriage, as you've mentioned, you need to have willingness and you need to have interest in doing so. And perhaps for some people, based on their experiences within the couple and within life, that willingness and energy just isn't there.
Exactly. So the ones who tilt in, they go full circle with what matters most, which is cherishing one another no matter what. And they build on that. And that can feed a wonderfully happy and contented, later stage part of a marriage.
Absolutely. Well, listen, Patti, I really want to thank you for joining me today and discussing marriage in general and all the characters of the Convention of Wives. I feel like you really know them and have taken.
I enjoyed getting to know them.
Your heart, so thank you. And your insights really about the challenges of marriage are wonderful, and I think will serve hopefully our viewing audience very well. So
I hope so.
Yes.
Well, it was a pleasure talking to you about this wonderful story, Debbie, and and all the aspects of complicated lives that are captured in these four separate individuals. It's a real pleasure.
Thank you so much. And for our readers who are watching, I hope you enjoyed the segment, and I would ask that you check back for additional segments that will be posted to the website soon. So thank you very much and take care. Thank you.